And this deep dive is actually part of the Beyond Global Waves series, produced by NEXUS-International Broadcasting Association. So our mission is to understand the landscape of Manzoni's early ethics, see how these, timeless principles apply to individuals, organizations, and maybe the broader media environment right now in 2025.
Yeah, and what's really striking is how Manzoni builds this bridge, drawing from Enlightenment thought, his own quite unique personal history, and even foreshadowing the Christian humanism he'd embrace later. It offers a pretty stark contrast to some of the trends we see around us today.
Okay, let's unpack this then. How do we even start to get a handle on Manzoni himself and this particular poem?
Well, Alessandro Manzoni, he was born into the Milanese nobility, late 18th century. But his family situation was, let's say, complex. His parents, Giulia Beccaria and Pietro Manzoni, had a difficult arranged marriage. Giulia, she was the daughter of the famous Enlightenment figure, Cesare Beccaria, a very independent intellectual.
Ah, right.
Pietro, on the other hand, was much older, more conservative, quite rigid.
And they separated, didn't they? Which must have been, wow, quite something back then.
Oh, absolutely. 1792, a separation in Catholic Lombardy, highly scandalous. Giulia moved to Paris, lived with Carlo Imbonati, this cultured, wealthy nobleman. Manzoni, meanwhile, stayed with his father initially, got sent to some pretty strict religious schools.
So physically distant from his mother, but the sources suggest they stayed close emotionally.
Very much so, yeah. And that really brings us to the poem In Morte di Carlo Imbonati. Manzoni wrote it in 1806, just after Imbonati died in 1805. He wrote it as a tribute, and it was addressed to his mother, Giulia, honoring Imbonati as this sort of moral guide.
Even though they'd never met.
Exactly. Even though they'd never actually met in person.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. The poem isn't just a tribute. The sources really frame it as a key moment in Manzoni's own ethical thinking, right? Like it blends that Enlightenment rationality from his mother's world with the beginnings of something else, something more introspective.
Precisely. And the core insights from your sources really dig into the specific ethical values that come out in the poem. They're often presented as advice, almost, from Imbonati's spirit to the young Manzoni in a vision within the poem. It's like posthumous mentoring.
Mentoring on how to live a good life. What kind of specific advice are we talking about? What are the key takeaways from the sources here?
Well, a major one is the emphasis on sincerity and integrity. Being true to yourself, holding on to your moral compass, even when it's difficult, when it's not the popular thing to do.
So it's not about just looking good, but actually being good internally.
Exactly. Inner coherence. And tied to that is this strong call for moral reflection, introspection, constantly looking inward, examining yourself, striving for virtue. And importantly, the sources point to respect for virtue and legacy. Manzoni honoring Imbonati is a way of saying, look to the virtuous, learn from them. Their legacy is a guide.
Right, learning from example.
Yes, and using that memory as a guide for the future.
The sources pulled out some specific lines, didn't they? Like an ethical checklist almost. They felt very potent.
They really are. Imbonati's spirit gives these direct instructions, like sentir, meditar, feel and meditate.
Feel and meditate. Interesting combo.
Ni poco esser contento. Be content with little. Dalla meta mai non torcer gli occhi. Never turn your eyes from the goal. And this one feels particularly relevant today. Conservar la mano pura e la mente. Keep your hand and your mind pure.
Keep your hand and mind pure. That's a high standard.
It is, and he goes on with more practical stuff too. Te burmane cose. Tanto sperimentar quanto ti basti per non curarle, basically. Experience life enough to understand it, but not so much you become consumed by superficial things. Gain perspective.
Okay, I see. Detachment through understanding.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah.
Then these powerful commands, non ti far mai servo, never make yourself a slave, to anything or anyone, non far tregua coi vili, make no truce with the vile.
Wow, no compromise there.
None. Il santo vero mai non tradir, never betray the holy truth.
The holy truth, make no truce with the vile. These feel less like abstract philosophical points and more like, direct calls to ethical action.
I think so too. And the final line highlighted is crucial, especially for today's world. Ne proferir mai verbo, que plaudar al vicio o la virtud herida, nor ever utter a word that praises vice or ridicules virtue.
Don't praise vice or ridicule virtue. That cuts against a lot of cynicism you hear.
It's a direct challenge to it, an injunction against just going with the flow if the flow is unethical.
Okay, so these are powerful principles from, Milan, early 1800s. How do we bridge that gap to 2025? It feels like a big jump.
It does, but your sources actually make that connection very explicitly. They translate Manzoni's ideas into modern terms, things that resonate right now. Think authenticity, continuous improvement through that moral reflection we talked about, genuinely valuing virtue in our communities and workplaces, and learning from the past, not just history lessons, but as an ethical resource.
And they got really specific about leadership and organizations too, didn't they? Almost like a Manzoni-inspired ethical toolkit for today.
Yes, absolutely. Things like promoting integrity over convention, doing what's right, not just what's easy or standard practice. Respecting personal legacy and the idea of mentorship, just like Manzoni did with Imbanati, even posthumously. Finding growth through moral reflection, making that part of how an organization works. Acknowledging human complexity, recognizing people aren't just resources, they have inner lives, histories.
Yeah, I remember seeing things like defining a purpose beyond profit, rooting the organization's mission in some kind of societal good.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, treating ethics as identity. It's not just a policy document or a PR angle, it's who you are.
The sources mention things like ethical gratitude, a purpose-driven narrative for brands, ethics as a kind of emotional intelligence, even cultivating inner growth in teams.
Right. And asking that fundamental question, what will still matter in 20 years? Instead of just what's trending right now.
That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? Away from the short-term noise.
Completely. It's about anchoring values in something deeper, like Manzoni did in personal history, in universal principles.
And this is where the sources bring in the NEXUS-International Broadcasting Association, right? How do they connect themselves to this Manzonian legacy?
Well, NEXUS-International Broadcasting Association, which is based right there in Milan, explicitly positions itself as embodying this tradition. They see themselves as carrying it forward. They're a nonprofit focused on global free speech and independent media.
And their mission sounds very much aligned with the principles we've been discussing, providing airtime for voices that often don't get heard, public access media, encouraging dialogue, and crucially, being non-commercial, non-governmental, and non-partisan.
Yeah, and their own ethical manifesto titled Broadcasting with Integrity in a Noisy World, it lists commitments that echo Manzoni. Things like freedom with responsibility, independence without isolation, dignity above influence, media as a public good. They explicitly root themselves in European Enlightenment and Christian humanism values like freedom, dignity, justice, compassion. They see it as upholding Milan's specific ethical legacy.
And they even quote Manzoni directly, don't they? Something about adversity.
Yes. Adversity is not your condemnation, but the time of your testing.
Okay.
And they frame their work as serving humanity during its current tests. Things like navigating rampant disinformation, polarization by offering clarity and giving voice. Their stated values like moral clarity, advocating for the powerless, resisting manipulation, global ethics, they map directly onto the Manzonian principles.
So it sounds like they see their whole project as a kind of modern continuation of this ethical project of Milanese Europe that Manzoni was such a key part of.
And that brings us to a really crucial point. So the sources raise this contrast they draw between this European, maybe Milanese ethical model and what they describe as some emerging global management styles that are, well, quite different.
Right. The sources describe the European model as grounded in human dignity, pluralism, media having a responsibility, protecting minorities, guided by legacy and principle. Maybe slower, maybe more bureaucratic sometimes, but aiming for moral coherence.
And then, in sharp contrast, and the sources are careful, they don't name specific countries or leaders. They describe these other emerging styles. Styles marked by populist opportunism, the manipulation of truth, a relentless focus on short-term gains, and even corporations starting to mimic divisive political tactics, like abandoning ethical policies or diversity efforts when they become inconvenient.
Yeah, they use strong language, saying these styles confuse charisma with character, performance with principles, and just being loud with having actual vision. Ethics becomes disposable.
Exactly. A trend to follow or discard. And this is the context where an organization like NEXUS-International Broadcasting Association finds its role, its countercultural stance. By championing unbiased, uncensored, transnational broadcasting, they're consciously presenting an alternative, a kind of beacon of ethical resistance against media models based purely on manipulation or populism. They're basically demonstrating that ethical clarity, that independence, it's not just some quaint historical ideal, it's vital, and it's possible even in today's media world.
It really ties it all together, doesn't it? Drawing that line from Manzoni's very personal quest for virtue in his challenging world, all the way to an organization today trying to embody those deep ethical principles in our incredibly complex global media landscape. It's a powerful parallel. So we've taken a deep dive into Alessandro Manzoni, pulled out insights from his early poem In Morte di Carlo Imbonati, explored those enduring ethical values, their surprising relevance today, and we've seen how an organization like NX US International Broadcasting Association views itself as continuing that specific ethical legacy, particularly in the media world.
And what really stands out, I think, is this core idea that ethics isn't supposed to be some flexible tactic, something you pick up and put down depending on what's convenient or popular. Instead, it's presented as a fundamental identity, something built through reflection, learning from history, committing to a clear purpose, and actively resisting that pull towards opportunism or whatever trend is shouting loudest.
Which really leads to a big question, doesn't it? In a world that feels so full of noise, shifting trends, constant pressure, how do you identify? How do you hold on to the enduring ethical foundations that you want to guide your own actions, your relationships, the groups you belong to? Something to think about, perhaps, as you continue your own deep dives.